Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we release Generation United's 2021 State of Grandfamilies report, reinforcing a strong foundation, equitable supports for basic needs of grandfamilies. I'm Sherry Brady, Vice President of Strategy and Program at the Children's Defense Fund, and a new proud board member of Generation United's Board of Directors. Excuse me. This year's State of Grandfamilies report was made possible by the support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Thank you. As we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. We welcome you to join us on social media using the hashtag 2021grandfamilies. Today we are using Zoom webinar, so you won't be able to see your fellow participants' faces, but we encourage you to use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen to continue to connect with each other. Everyone attending today will receive an email with links to the slides and a recording of today's event. This will also be posted on the Generations United website. Today marks the release of Generation United's 8th annual State of Grandfamilies report. Grandfamilies, or kinship families, are families where grandparents and other relatives or close family friends are raising children. This is an issue that is really near and dear to my heart, as I spent much of my youth being raised by my grandmother, while my parents were grappling with some serious issues. I feel very fortunate that that my extended family was there to support me and help raise me and step in when my parents needed help. I am continuing this practice of love as I had guardianship of my nephew, for much of this pandemic when my brother was sick. It is vital, and it was very important that I was very fortunate that I was able to care for him and support him during that time, because not everyone is so lucky. And I think this makes it even more vital that we have systems in place that are responsive to and supportive of grandfamilies and kinship care. In this report series from Generations United really shines a light on the myriad of challenges and issues that these families face while providing an incredible service to our country. Each report includes infographics that show the latest data on the number of children who live in grandfamilies and offer recommendations to help guide the development and support of policies and service for grandfamilies. This report highlights how the systems and services that help families in the United States were not designed for grandfamilies, leaving children and caregivers in these families with inequitable access to key resources to help their families thrive. This report also highlights the unique strengths of these families and elevates how children fare better with relatives and do best when their relative caregivers are given the supports they need to support their families. To share with you the report's key findings and recommendations, I'm pleased to introduce Jaya Lent. Jaya has been an invaluable member of the Generations United team for 20 years. She currently serves as the Deputy Executive Director overseas the work of the National Center on Grandfamilies. Hey, Jaya, thanks for all that you do.
Thank you, Sherry. And thank you for joining us today as we release this year's State of Grandfamilies report. The report was informed and inspired by Grand Voices, our national network of grandfamily caregiver advocates, 3 of whom will join us later in the program. Grandfamilies are unique, but not uncommon families. They often come together with little to no warning. A grandma, uncle, or godmother may get a call in the middle of the night and have to make a split-second decision about whether or not to take in the children. Grandfamilies come together for a variety of reasons, including substance use, incarceration, mental health challenges, parental death or illness, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 2.6 million children are being raised in these families. The foster care system relies heavily on relatives to care for children. In fact, over the last decade, the percentage of children in foster care who are living with relatives has increased from 26% in 2010 to 34% in 2020. And while more than a third of children in foster care are now being raised by relatives, only a small portion of children raised in grandfamilies are in the foster care system. In fact, for every 1 child being raised by kin in foster care, 18 children are being raised by kin outside of foster care. As Sherry said, research shows that when children cannot remain with their parents, they do better in the care of relatives than with non-relatives, and best when those relatives get the support they need. Yet, most systems to help grandfamilies in our country routinely leave grandfamilies without critical support needed to provide for the children. Many of these systems look at the family's characteristics instead of the children's needs when determining eligibility for services or participation in the program. For example, without a legal relationship to her grandson, a grandmother may be unable to enroll him in school or consent to critical medical care for him. An uncle, grandfather, or other male caregiver may be overlooked by the child welfare system as a potential caregiver for a child simply because they're male. And the vast majority of children and grandfamilies do not get the same financial assistance and support as children in the traditional foster care system. And families may be fearful of asking for help, such as one grandfather that was highlighted in the report who asked for help with formula and diapers after suddenly taking on the care of his granddaughter, only to be told by the caseworker, if you need to be asking for all of these things, maybe you aren't the right placement for this child. A gut punch to a grandfather who was doing everything he could to ensure his granddaughter would thrive. These siloed, inadequate, and inequitable systems leave grandfamilies out in the cold. People of all races, ages, and socioeconomic statuses live in grandfamilies, but it's important to note that Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native children are more likely to live in these families. The inequities grandfamilies face are further perpetrated and compounded by racial inequities. However, there are solutions to address the inequities facing grandfamilies. This report offers solutions in the form of recommendations, and here is a snapshot. Involve grandfamilies in decision-making. They must be invited to share their lived experience and ideas to inform policymaking and encourage systematic change. Support all grandfamilies according to their needs, not according to their characteristics. Apply a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to policy, practice, messaging, and materials impacting grandfamilies. And educate federal, state, and local policymakers to enact policies and practices and adopt research approaches to better support grandfamilies. Support the development and sustained use of quality Kinship Navigator programs, and promote financial equity for grandfamilies by creating a kinship caregiver tax credit and improving access to foster care maintenance payments and temporary assistance for needy families, known as TANF. We hope this report and today's panel will be informative, but that it will also be a call to action to create meaningful changes for grandfamilies. This report comes at an exciting time. The federal government has recently taken several significant steps that recognize the important role of grandfamilies and the need to better support them. As part of the American Rescue Act, Congress provided funding for the first ever National Technical Assistance Center on grandfamilies and kinship families. Generations United competed for the contract, and we are thrilled that we have been awarded the cooperative agreement to operate the center in collaboration with several stellar partners. Anna Beltran, my longtime colleague at Generations United, has been appointed the director of the center. And just last month, the Federal Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Council released their report to Congress. I have been honored to co-chair that council, serving alongside other leaders in the field, federal agency representatives, and most importantly, grandparent and other relative caregivers. We will drop a link to that report in the chat and invite you to share it broadly along with our State of Grandfamilies report, which complements and builds on the 22 high-level recommendations from the council. And now I'm pleased to introduce Amy Goyer, the lead author of this year's State of Grandfamilies report. Amy is a national expert in caregiving and multi-generational families, a valued longtime colleague and friend of Generations United, and today we'll be moderating a panel with 3 incredible grandfamily caregivers who are also part of Generations United's Grand Voices Network. Amy.
Thank you so much, Jaya. It was truly an honor to write this year's report. And it's a topic, as you all know, I'm very passionate about. So it really is a joy to work on, and always a joy to work with you all at Generations United. I wrote the report, and as I was doing that, I had the great pleasure of talking with quite a few grandfamilies. And we're really fortunate today that 3 of the grandfamilies who are profiled in the report are going to be with us today to share their experiences. So now I'm going to invite Robert Brown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Joanne Clow of Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, and Rosalie Tallbull of Denver, Colorado, to turn on your cameras and join the panel. All right. Are you there? Rosalie, I'm not seeing everybody. Everybody there? Okay. I see Joanne and I see Robert. Okay. Rosalie, you want to turn on your camera? Great. Thank you. And you can unmute yourself so that you're able to talk freely and openly. It's always fun, the technology, isn't it? Okay, so I want to start out by asking each of you to give sort of a brief overview of your personal grandfamily situation, how your grandfamily was formed, and about the children you're raising. Robert, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yes, thank you, Amy. My name is Robert Brown, and I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And me and my wife, we're raising 3 grandsons, ages 21, 17, and 16. And we've had those children since they were 2.5, 8 months old, and 5 years old. And the reason why we were raising them and we adopted them is because their mother was killed along with 4 other family members by my daughter's husband.
Yes, and I know that you went through a lot of trauma with that, Robert, and in fact, your wife was also injured and shot as well, correct?
Yes, my wife was shot in the back of the head. Fortunately, she survived that, and that allowed her to lead a productive life.
So how has this impacted you? I know it's been how many years ago?
It was May 21st, 2006. So I guess what, 15 years ago?
Yeah, so about 15 years ago. How has this impacted you and your family? I know the children's father is still in prison, is that correct?
Yes, he was given death sentence, 5 death sentences plus 50 years for attempted murder of my wife. And
right.
Impacting our family, well, it was overwhelming, the trauma that affected us, because we were all, just traumatized by such a heinous act.
Yeah, really, really rough. And you worked for 12 years to adopt your grandchildren?
Yes, I did. We went through several lawyers before we found one that was willing to go the distance with us and get these children adopted.
And you were working at the time, correct? And your wife was working as well?
Yes, I was working and my wife was working also.
But you have since retired?
Yes, I have retired because I looked at working and taking care of these children. Doesn't mix. Not a full-time job anyway.
Yeah. And your wife works for the school system, correct?
She works for the school system. She was a school teacher, now what she's called a lead facilitator. So she's not in the classroom. She's more or less make sure the teacher's doing what they're supposed to be doing.
And how are your grandkids doing now?
They're doing fine. 2 of them are in high school, and one of them started college, and he's working right now. He's at work today, so they're doing fine.
Amazing. I'm sure that you and your wife are the reason for that. So thank you so much for all you've done for them. And we're going to hear a little bit more from you and about your story in a little bit. Next, I want to go to Joanne. So Joanne, tell us, a little bit about your situation.
Well, my situation is, first, I was a single mother of my own two daughters because my ex-husband decided to stop seeing them when they were like 4 and 5 years old after not prevailing in the custody battle. So he literally never saw them again. So they were born 19 months apart. So I raised them. And when they were 22 and 20, my 22-year-old daughter, Emily, had a baby. And she had been struggling with heroin addiction for 5 years. And she got clean when she found out she was pregnant. And she did pretty well for about a year. And then on December 3rd, 2016, she relapsed, and the first stuff she bought was 100% pure fentanyl, and it killed her instantly. And she and her baby, my granddaughter, were living at my house at the time. My granddaughter was 9 months old. So I was just 2 months shy of turning 60, and suddenly I was raising a 9-month-old granddaughter. My other daughter was a second semester junior at American University at the time. The father of the child was involved in her life, but was also struggling with addiction and was not able to take care of the child. And so when he kind of started making some comments that he was going to try to take the money that we raised at the funeral for my granddaughter's educational fund and move to Louisiana, I went and filed an emergency intervention action in my daughter and his custody case and was awarded custody. So I didn't go through children and welfare or kinship program. I did it myself through the custody system. I'm a family law attorney. So that's how my granddaughter came to be in my life. And I'll be 65 in February, and she'll be 6 in February. So I'm starting all over again, raising a daughter type person when my two are almost completely out of the nest. So it's been a huge change for me and where I thought I'd be in my point in life right now.
I'm sure. And financially, and your social life and your health and all kinds of effects.
Yeah, I had a heart attack when my daughter had relapsed from one of her sober living houses about 10 months before she died. And then I also had, was struggling to help contribute towards my other daughter's college education. And financially, I was the Titanic before this happened, but it was definitely the iceberg that took down the ship, because immediately I had out of pocket $15,000 of daycare a year immediately the minute my daughter passed away, because we had been able to do daycare for my granddaughter between my daughter and I and our work schedules. So suddenly I needed to be able to have her in a daycare so I could resume doing my career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just an incredible impact on your life. And what is your legal relationship with your granddaughter now?
I have primary physical custody of her, and I do have shared legal custody with her father. And finally, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, last October, I finally let him start having unsupervised contact with her. Before that, he had to exercise all his contact with his mother or another adult. And he has a new girlfriend now, and at the time they were pregnant. Now they have a child that's about 7 or 8 months old, and she has a son who's 7. So they moved in an apartment together, and my granddaughter goes there almost every weekend, and we all get along. I've made a very hard decision the day my daughter died that I could blame this guy for the rest of my life for what happened to my daughter and her addiction, or I could love him because she was my granddaughter's father. And that's what I decided to do. So we get along. I work very hard to get along. And if we don't get along, we go to court, they decide it, and then we go back to getting along.
Amazing, Joanne. That's really is truly amazing. And I know, Robert, you talk also about forgiving the father of your grandchildren. It's just incredible to me what you all have done in the face of such trauma. And Rosalie, you also have a grandson who went through a great deal of trauma. Tell us about your story.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Good afternoon. My name is Rosalie Talbot, and I live in Denver, Colorado. And I'm raising my 13-year-old grandson, Mauricio, who was placed in my home when he was 3 years old. And he is now 13 years old, and he is growing into an awesome young man. And he is in the 8th grade, and it's just unbelievable how far he has come, because he was he had severe trauma. He was removed from my daughter's custody, his mother's custody, when he was, like I said, 3 years old, but previously she hid out. It was a child welfare case, and she hid out for a whole year before this happened, and he was removed from her home due to severe domestic violence and alcoholism. And the social service, the police took him to the social service system department, and it was very traumatic for him. He had already been going through a lot of trauma. And at the time I was in Montana off and on for a year, taking care of my mother, who had been placed in a nursing home, and she had just been placed in hospice when a social worker called me, and we were able to make arrangements for a family member to keep him until I could fly back to Denver. And so it was a very traumatic experience going through, living through, and for a child, it was just almost unbelievable. But we all have, my family is very, very close and strong, and we all banded together to work to provide a stable background for this young man, and it is showing.
Yes, and I know, and folks, when you look at the report, you'll see pictures of Rosalie and Maurizio and her Rosalie's other granddaughter, Amber. So tell us a little bit how Amber has been part of this, because I know you said you were in Montana when you got the call.
Yes.
And Amber helped out.
Yes, Amber worked for the Children's Museum at the time, and she had also been vetted by the social services because we had attended several of the family meetings. And when I received the call in Montana from the social worker, I gave her Amber's name. And so she needed to check that out. And Amber was able to go and secure him so he was not placed in foster care. So I'm eternally grateful for that. Amber, I raised Amber also as a young child and young girl. Her parents separated when she was a young child, and she moved into my home completely when she was 13, 14 years old. So I put her through school, college, and she has just embraced Maurizio. They're like mother and son. She has just been such a godsend to us, and we are so grateful for that.
Yes. So, I mean, you're talking about raising more than one grandchild at different times. And also in many ways, Amber as a cousin has helped raise her cousin Maurizio.
Yes, that is true. And she's unmarried, no children, but she is devoting her life to Maurizio and me, and it is awesome.
So Rosalie, how has this experience affected you in terms of your work situation, your health, your financial security, social life, that sort of thing?
Well, it was very difficult. I took an early retirement due to my mother's illness, and I was her caretaker. And so I was already retired, but previously when Maurizio was a baby, I still worked, but I also kept him. His mother's alcoholism was getting worse. And for the first 3 years of his life, I had him for many days, many nights, many weeks and months. And I always had to provide for him or miss work or something. So it made it much easier to take care of Maurizio because I could be in the home being retired. And since he was so traumatized, he needed mental health assistance. And I was giving no assistance at all from the social service system, even though he was a ward of that county's system. And I fought for almost 7 or 8 months to even get any type of services. And it was very difficult.
Yeah, very difficult. I know. And that's a perfect segue. I want to kind of go into now talking about the inequities and the difficulties that you've all experienced. The report focuses on inequities among services and supports for grandfamilies and the fact that not all grandfamilies get the same supports. And I'd like to talk about how those inequities have impacted you each and your family. You know, you've all stepped up to prevent your grandchildren from entering the foster care system. As you said, Rosalie, your grandson was initially a ward of the system, but was placed with you in a what we might call a diverted way. But there can be some major differences in supports that grandfamilies receive inside and outside the system, the foster care system, the child welfare system. So I would love for each of you to kind of talk about how being outside the system has impacted you and your family. And I know each of you also, through your work and your advocacy work, you interact with a lot of grandfamilies. So feel free to kind of bring in some other examples as well that you've seen happen. Joanne, can you start? I know, for example, you mentioned the difficulty with childcare and you had trouble accessing support for childcare. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, and first of all, I'm a family law attorney. I'm a sole practitioner. I have a small practice. I help a lot of families that really can't afford attorneys most of the time, but I'm a private lawyer. And when this happened to me, I knew nothing about any of these systems, the child welfare system. I knew if I went to a support conference with a client, sometimes the client got a subsidy for daycare, but that's all I knew because people that use those programs can't hire private attorneys. So I really did not know anything about most of that. And the one thing I found out pretty much, and in my circumstance, because you're already so devastated by the loss, in my case, my granddaughter or my daughter had died, you're not in your best place to be seeking help or helping yourself and finding things. There was no central place to find anything out. I did finally, I think a month after my daughter passed away, find out that there was an office you could go to fill out papers to apply for daycare subsidy. So I did that. And when I went to the office for the in-person thing to get the paperwork, they were really not very nice to me at all. And they acted like I was trying to take benefits, that I was some wealthy person in there trying to steal benefits from a needy family. And that was not true. And I was not wealthy. And so I filled out all the paperwork and they made me give them tons of other information because I was self-employed. I didn't have a typical paycheck. And after I gave them all of that, they rejected me and said they counted my daughter, my younger daughter's financial aid package at college and the money she earned in her work study program as part of my household income to put me over the top to exclude my granddaughter from getting daycare assistance. So they told me I could appeal it, and I'm a lawyer, but I couldn't appeal it. I just couldn't even deal with it anymore. I then somebody told me I could get Social Security benefits since Emily had died for my granddaughter, since my daughter Emily had worked since she was 14. So I went to the Social Security office in my county and waited in line for like 3 hours and get to the desk and they go, oh, well, you don't go to this county, you live closer to Harrisburg, so you go there. So first I'm in the wrong place, but they were very nice and they felt sorry for me. So they pulled the stuff up on the computer and they said, oh, you can't get these benefits. Her dad's already applied for them because he has custody. And I go, no, he doesn't have custody. I have custody. So we had to cancel his appointment. Same thing, I got a call from the WIC. My daughter had WIC for herself and before she had the baby and after she had the baby. And they were calling to see why my daughter missed her appointment. When I explained she died, they said, oh, well, you can come in since you have custody. So when I called in to make the appointment, they said I couldn't because the father had made the appointment because he had the child and was going to get the WIC benefits. So basically an active heroin user knew how to apply for things quicker and faster than me. And so every place I went, I had to kind of get that canceled so I could go forward with getting that. I was fortunate that my daughter had worked enough that Carter does get a monthly Social Security stipend. It wasn't enough to pay half the daycare, but at least it paid. I could use it for half the day, a little less than half the daycare. We were also fortunate we did use WIC. Until this year, I just stopped doing it because it was too hard for me to take a day off work, get Carter a day out of school and take her in there to get weighed and measured and people to tell me, and then and I don't mean to belittle the program, you get about $45 worth of stuff a month, but it's an awful lot of time expense on me that I didn't have to do that. So we did bow out of it our last year. I also was fortunate because when my daughter passed away, both she and my granddaughter were on public health insurance. At the time this happened, I did not have health insurance anymore because I had gone through so much financial issues with my daughter's addiction and my business going very slow because of me spending so much time on my family dilemmas. I could no longer afford private health insurance. So fortunately, they do not count my income at all in calculating the eligibility for my granddaughter's health insurance because I don't have a legal obligation to support my granddaughter because I'm her grandmother, not her parent. So she does have health insurance and she's had that, but each place you go has a different criterion for how they determine if you're eligible. And that just drives you crazy. So it's just the bureaucracy. And I'm a lawyer and I couldn't understand half of the stuff they were telling me.
Yeah.
And you're also not at I can't underestimate, almost every one of us had some traumatic event that led to us starting to raise our grandchildren. And you're not at your best when you're in there trying to navigate all this.
Exactly. And it's exactly that when you're in grief and trauma and suffering loss, to try to navigate these systems. Do you think if your granddaughter had been in the foster care system, you would have had more supports available? Or she would have had more supports available, I should say?
Possibly, but the problem with that is then you have Child Protective Services really in control of your child. They could have decided, I have a bad knee, I'm getting my hip replaced this month. They could have decided, oh, you're too old, this is a baby. This baby should be with a young family. You know, if I had called them, they could have come in and said, no, you can't have her. So I did not call them. After the first couple of months, I was told I should apply to be part of the kinship program, that they would pay for daycare and some other stuff, but they don't let you can't go into it after the fact because I was already supporting Carter and taking care of her. I was not eligible for that. I would never have wanted to be part of that system, but I do think some of the benefits people in that system get should also be extended to grandparents that are doing it privately, because we are saving the system millions and millions of dollars every year. And we have these kids in our home. They're not running the risk of being harmed in foster care or moved around 5 or 6 placements a year. We are really, and all the stuff shows they do so much better when they're raised by a relative. So I think there should be ability to get some of those same services that are available to kinship people or parents that are, or people that are taking care of kids from the foster care system or children in youth system that are not given to us because we're private. It just because we're individuals. That to me is inequitable, and that should change.
Very well said. And in the report, we do talk about the fact that research indicates that children do better with family. I know that Rosalie, you as a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe of Montana, you were not living on the reservation. You were living in Denver, and your grandson was in Denver. You were there helping your mother at the time you got the call, but that was not your residence. So when you went to court, was the tribe able to provide any support for you?
No, absolutely no assistance at all. My case was unbelievable. The inequities were just unbelievable. I flew in from, when I was notified about Mauricio, I flew into Denver on a Tuesday evening. I was notified that I had to show up to court at 9 a.m. Wednesday morning. There was a caseworker there. She didn't even say hello. We went before the judge, and I was not given any opportunity to talk. They reviewed the facts, and the child was placed in my home on a temporary basis. And that went on for a year and a half, almost 2 years. I did not have a lawyer. I did not know that I needed a lawyer. Both mother and father were provided legal expertise, and it took almost 2 long years before he was permanently placed in my home, in my custody. And the inequities within the system were unbelievable. The first thing that happened, well, that was the first thing that happened. And the second thing, I asked for assistance because since I took an early retirement, I did not have an income, and I did not get any of my savings, pension, anything. So for the first 7 or 8 months, I was in desperate need, and my family helped enormously. So the case was kind of an odd oddball situation. The legal case was in Arapahoe County. I resided in Denver County, and they both threw the ball back and forth to each other. And I did not receive any type of assistance at all. And as I would take the child in for hearings or a visitation, I would check the bulletin boards, and I seen a notice for grandparents group. And I called that number and I showed up, and they saved my life.
Mhm.
Literally.
Yes, and I want you to talk more about that in a few minutes. I want to delve deeper into one of the things that you said. You were talking about the fact that the Mauricio for almost 2 years was in the custody of the child welfare system, but with you, but you were not a foster parent. You
No,
were getting, and you were also not given any supports. I know that you had difficulty with your case manager and communication and trying to access the things. I remember you telling me, which struck me so much, that you were in the waiting room, you were waiting there while the supervised visitation was taking place with Mauricio's parents. And you heard other family members in there talking about different supports they were getting. And that's how you learned about the things that you could access.
yes, that was one of the first ways I learned. And I found a lady went up to the receptionist and asked if her emergency check was available. So after that, I went and talked to her and asked her, how do you get emergency funds? And so she told me really briefly. So then when my caseworker, at that time, for 7 months, I did not know that this young lady was my caseworker, Mauricio's caseworker. I was never given any information. Just show up for court, bring the child to custody visit or for visitation. And when this lady, the social worker, came into the room, I told her, excuse me, I'd like to ask you a question. So she came up to me after dealing with a young lady, and I asked her that I told her that Mauricio is desperately in need of mental health assistance. And he also needed to go be in a preschool. His attention span just was not good. And she, in front of the receptionist and in the crowded room, she told me that I was just looking for a babysitter. And I burst out crying and left. And it was very traumatic, going through everything, but that was traumatic. And that I started going to the social service system to try to find out how I could get that help. And I went as far as to the executive director of that county. And that's how I was told that this caseworker was my caseworker. And I found out that I was my family was her first case.
So just by the luck of the draw, you got someone who wasn't quite as well versed at things and wasn't communicating with you as well about some of the supports that you could have accessed.
Yes,
It must be very, very frustrating.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was. So how will you ask me the question, or should I go into how I found grandparents group?
Let's wait and talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about the things that have helped all of you, but first let's give Robert a chance to talk about some of the inequities that he's experienced. So I'll come back to you. Okay, Rosalie? Robert, I know you talked a little bit about the fact that you had to go through 12 years before you could adopt your grandchildren, and that you had 3 different attorneys. And I know it had a big impact financially on you, all those attorneys and all the courts and all of that time. How did the children's father have legal support? Did he have to pay for legal, every time that he questioned it or tried to go to court? Was there inequities there?
Every time we would make an attempt to adopt the children, the children's father, he was incarcerated, and he would be going through the family courts trying to block it. Whereas the adoptions, they go through the children's court, juvenile court. And so he would file something in family court, and then they would have to turn around and send it to juvenile court. And so the lawyers would have to try to work it out from there whatever he's trying to block. Since his rights were not terminated at that time, he just had the freedom to, just try to block anything we did. So what we wound up doing, as we were going through these different lawyers, certain circumstances came up with him. The first one got sick, and so we had to try another one. And, the second one, he couldn't do what the first one did. They had to undo all that, start from scratch. And so then the second one, he just, passed away. And so all of that work was more or less down the drain. And so what we had to do, after my wife heard from a friend of hers about, grandparents conference. And so we went to that, and there was a young man, there was a lawyer that was speaking. And after he spoke, we had a chance to talk to him and explain everything to him. And he said, I can get it done for you. It's going to cost you a little money, because, he had to sort of undo all that had been done. And he had to go through like a maze, to try to get all of that done. But in his aspect, it took about 3 years for him to get it done.
Yeah, and the adoption went through just before the oldest 18th birthday, correct?
Yes, the matter of fact, the day that we went before the judge and was granted, the adoption, it was the day before the grandson's birthday. His birthday was on a Saturday, and we went to court that Friday. And he turned 18 that Saturday.
Wow. So that must have been so frustrating, but you finally got through it. And yet you had all of these legal fees. Your grandchildren's father did not have any legal fees that he had to pay because he was incarcerated. His legal support was free.
Right. His legal support was free. It's amazing, people that are incarcerated, all the things that they have access to. And, I would hear different things. Deputies would tell me that, he had access to all kind of computers and stuff. And, he was listening to CNN and looking at reruns of Perry Mason and Matlock. And so that was where he was getting all his legal advice. And just because something works on TV, that doesn't necessarily mean in real life it's going to be the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. But it sure threw a lot of hitches and dragged the process on for all of you. Yeah.
Yes.
I know also, Robert, that you have been very involved in the Grandparents Raising Grandchildren of Louisiana group. And I know you interact with other grandfamilies that way. What are some of the other inequities that you've seen or experienced yourself?
Some of the inequities that I've seen and have talked to other grandparents about is that the slowness of the process, that they can't, they talk to the policymakers, and the policymakers have, 100 different things on their plate, and then they just, get pushed to the side about their situation. And then also they talk about all the expenses that they be incurring, because you have a lot of grandparents that are still working. You have some grandparents that are, don't get much money for, their efforts in a job. So, they have to make, ends meet with, very little resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's just so many inequities that seem to come into play here. We've just touched on a few of them here in our grandfamilies experiences. In the report, we go into great detail about many of the inequities and the characteristics that cause these inequities. Joanne talks about the fact that they thought she was rich just because she was a lawyer, and all lawyers are not rich. So that's a characteristics that assumptions are made about. You mentioned also your age, that you were nervous that they might say, she wouldn't be a good caregiver, when in fact you're the best caregiver for your granddaughter. We've had inequities between the tribe, where Rosalie, if she had been on reservation, then the tribe would have been more involved in her case and probably been very helpful, but they did not have the resources to be able to help her because she didn't live on the reservation. Not all the tribes are very well resourced. So we've heard about a lot of the inequities. I want transition now to what you had brought up, Rosalie. What's been helpful to you? In the report, we outline various services and supports that are helpful to grand families. And we profile 3 different programs that are providing some incredible services and support. So I encourage all of you to check those out in the report. So I want to hear from each of you. What's been most helpful to you and made the biggest difference for you and your grandkids? Rosalie, go ahead and go back and talk about what you were wanting to share about the grandparent support group.
Okay. One of the very first outlets that helped me, and like I stated, saved my life, was a bulletin notice, board notice that grandparents group, and what time they would be meeting and everything. And I called them and I showed up. And the very first meeting, the moderator had previously worked in the social service system, so she was very well versed in getting assistance for families, and not only grand families, but all kinship. And so that put me on the most awesome road. I was a member of that for many, many years. And just my case alone and how long it took and how everything that I went through, my family went through, I now strongly advocate and assist grand families who are going through the social service system. And I am a proud member of Generations United, and I am so grateful that I have this opportunity to share my story with the world. It was very traumatic.
And I know that you have said that that support group connected you with preschool for your grandson, helped you understand how to apply for benefits for him. And it's a really good example of how sometimes one contact, that one note on that bulletin board, made all the difference for you. So all of you programs out there who are watching, you know, sometimes you probably feel like, oh, I put these flyers out. Is it doing any good? It's doing good. You know, it can be effective if it helps one grandparent that way. Joanne, what has helped you the most? What's been the most positive in your journey?
Well, I think the most positive thing in my journey was really private people helping more than public, and my own journey through learning how to see what I could and could not do, what help we could and could not get. We didn't have a grandparent support group here, so we formed one. And the first meeting, no one showed up except the couple of grandparents and the moderator. And instead of canceling it, we just advertised it again the next month. And after we had maybe 10 or 11 people come, and after that, they asked if we could meet twice a month. So unfortunately, due to COVID, we have not been meeting, but that was very helpful just to have a place. And we had our children by all different ways. Some had living children, its children were placed with them. Some, like me, had their children pass away. So that was very supportive. But I just got active to try to make it easier. My daughter Emily used to always say, Mommy, it shouldn't be this hard for somebody pregnant on heroin to get in rehab and be taken care of till she can have a healthy baby. And we were going to do social advocacy together. But when she passed, I've just been doing the advocacy on my own to make it easier for grandparents. I helped in Pennsylvania with the Kinship Navigator program, which supposedly you can log in these different states that have it. And it's a one main place for grandparents to go to get information. Because a lot of us aren't that tech savvy either. Like before this started, Diane was telling me just log on Messenger, but I think you can't log on Messenger on my computer because I log on it on my phone. So don't get it. So, because that's how I am. So that to me, we had to make our own way here. I had to figure out a way to get the help other than the few places that we had it. My Senator Bob Casey's office was very helpful wherever they could be. And I got no help from the local congressman when I told them my daughter had passed away from an opioid overdose and I needed help. She said, well, we really don't help with that. And they hung up on me.
Oh, Joanne.
I had lots of crying in parking lots and buildings and
yeah.
And I'm a strong fighter for other people. I'm not like a wallflower, but the doors that were smashed in my face took me to my knees because there's such a stigma over. My granddaughter smacked her teacher when she was 2.5, and they expelled her permanently from daycare because they thought it was because her mother took drugs, that she was brain damaged or something. There's nothing wrong with her. She's a tad testy at some point, and her teacher bent down to yell at her, and she bent over, and my granddaughter slapped her face, and she was expelled permanently from daycare. So then I had nowhere to go in the middle of the summer. I had to get 3 daycares. One could take her 2 days a week, one could take her 2 days a week, and then I hired a person to come the day, and I couldn't even remember which day she went to which place. But we
Yeah.
got through it. We got through it. So.
But that's another inequity that you point out right there, that the assumptions and the bias against her because her mother was experiencing substance use. Robert, your family experienced very severe trauma, and I know you had some things that really helped with that. Tell us about that. What helped your family deal with that?
Well, there was a sheriff's deputy. She was in charge of a memorial service every year for people that have had lost loved ones. And so she connected with us, and she told us about this organization, Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center. And it's, a place where people can go and they can, get counseling and, grief counseling. And at that place, they had a psychologist, and she was just very good with my grandsons. And, she took them under her wing, and she would always have individual meetings with them, and then as well as group meetings with the children, and have one with the parents or the grandparents, whatever case. And also, she also counseled me and my wife and any other family members that wanted to. Also, my employer, they agreed to pay for counseling through another source to anyone in my family, that's connected to my family. That gave them 3, free counseling sessions. So that helped all of us very well. And also the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center, it was an ongoing thing, and, didn't have to pay for any of that.
Yeah, that was amazing for you to be able to connect with the police officer who was informed. That right there was a lucky break. And then to connect with the center that offered no cost services around the trauma and the grief support. And then you also had employer supports, which we talk about also in the report. And Robert, Rosalie and Joanne talked a little bit about how they have become advocates because of their experience and trying to help others and change things. Why have you, like I said, you're part of the Grand Voices Network, you work with the Louisiana group. What motivates you to advocate for other grand families?
Well, I feel there's a need for the policymakers to be able to hear what the grandparents have to say. Just because one person is saying something, that doesn't necessarily mean that the policymakers are going to hear. But if they hear directly from grandparents and other relatives that are raising these children, then they, can understand the plight that we're in.
Yeah, and I know you've said to me in our conversations that it takes everybody working together to make the change.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and all of you are doing that. You're all taking your experiences and making change. So that leads me to my last question. We have time for one more quick question. I want to ask each of you to share one last thought, either a bit of advice for grand families or something you'd like to see happen or change. What are your last thoughts? Rosalie, you go first.
Okay, one thing that, like I stated before, helped me was the grandparents group, and more support for just those types of groups, because grandparents raising grandchildren it's such an inequitable place that no one ever thinks that it would happen to them until it does happen to you. So I have become a strong advocate, like I stated before, and I work tirelessly with grandparents, and especially, well, all grandparents, but especially with Native American grandparents who are so underserved. So
Wonderful. Yes, and I know you're making a really big difference that way. Joanne, how about you? One last thought?
I guess my last thought is just for people to listen to us and understand most of us already raised our own families and have worked most of our lives and done all of that. And it's supposed to be the part of your life where you can wind down and be with your grandchildren. And I don't want to cry. In my situation, I don't even get to be a grandma. That was kind of stolen from me because my granddaughter calls me mommy, and it breaks my heart because my daughter used to, when she was very angry at me, point out all too frequently, I am not her mother, I am her grandmother, and to butt out of it. But I didn't get that chance. When it happened, I stepped in. And so I just think people need to realize we need help. We're not asking for handouts, but we should be at least accorded the same type of help people in the kinship program are afforded, or people in the foster care system are accorded, or people who are mothers and fathers are accorded. It's appalling that if you're a grandparent at a child protective services thing, you don't get a free attorney, but both the parents, who many times are the people that caused the harm, why the children are being removed anyhow, get free lawyers. It's broken, and they need to listen to us to learn. We are very resilient people. We are not asking people to save us. We are just asking them to take their feet off our necks and help us take care of these beautiful, wonderful kids as long as we're able. It's very scary not knowing how long you're able. I have surgery next Friday. My granddaughter is terrified I'm going to die, and I have to explain to her, I don't think I'm going to die. It's hard. It's very hard. So
yeah, extremely well said. All of those things are so true. And Robert, how about you? Your final thoughts?
My final thought, part of it comes from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, trust not, lean not to your own understanding, always acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So what we have to do is acknowledge God and let him do the work for us. Let him put the people in our path and take people that are not in our path, get them out of the way so we can get the progress that we need.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. We've used up all of our time, but we could talk with you all for hours. Thank you so much for opening your lives and your experiences and your emotions to all of us to make this a very real experience. I want to thank all of you for all that you've done to help with this report and that you do every day for your grandkids. I want to acknowledge also all the other grandparents that I spoke to for the report, and an uncle, and all the kin that I interviewed. Thank you so much. And also the 3 programs that I interviewed in the program profiles. Be sure to check those out in the group. Thank you to all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and now hand things back to you, Sherry.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you for this panel. Thank you so much to Rosalie Talbot, Robert Brown, and Joanna Clough for your willingness to share your insights and your personal stories with us today. Such powerful stories. Thank you for your strength, your commitment to your grandchildren, and your commitment to advocating on behalf of all grandfamilies. You are truly warriors. And as we mentioned earlier, the report is currently living online at Generations United website, www.gu.org, and the link will be dropped here again. You can see it on the slide here. We invite you to view, share, and download the report. Use it as a tool in your work and advocacy on behalf of grandfamilies. And I will leave you with this quote from our panelist, Mr. Brown, that's featured in the report. We spent our 401ks and retirement and stuff like that all to keep these children safe and keep them in a good environment so they can do things without looking over their shoulder. That's the only thing I can do. Do the best for them. You have done more than the best for them, above and beyond. Thank you so much. And it proves to us that the power really lives in the folks with lived experience who are doing this work. Grandfamilies, are giving their all to the children that they raise. We can and must do better to support them in this journey. It will take all of us working together to confront the inequities that grandfamilies face so that they can have the supports they need to not just survive, but also to thrive. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Have a good one.